a very brief introduction. Just want to remind members that the next meeting is May 28th, and that's also our annual general meeting for those of you who are paid up members. You should have seen a notice for the AGM in the newsletter, which has recently been circulated. I believe that'll be at 7. Again, the notice is all in the newsletter. And after following that at our presentation at our normal time at 7:30, it'll be a reimagined history of Port Dalhousie by David Serafino. So again, that'll be May 28th, again, the 4th Thursday in May. The other thing I always want to remind people too is about, memberships. Please, if you're able to get a membership, you can pay by e-transfer. We now have that. You can see, again, information in the newsletters, especially for those who've been members before and would like to take out a membership again this year. So on that basis, those are my announcements. I will ask Elizabeth to introduce our speaker.
Okay, and we're so happy to finally meet Michele-Elise Burnet. We booked her, Michele-Elise, over 2 years ago, and it was very exciting. And of course, the pandemic happened, and we never dreamed that it would be this long before we actually got to see you. Anyway, as far as an introduction, Michele-Elise Burnet is a Metis Ontario citizen with Algonquin roots from the Bear Clan. Michele-Elise began her career in the broadcasting business as owner-operator of Spirit 91.7 FM radio, along with her mother, Suzanne Rochon Burnet. They were the first Indigenous persons to be granted commercial broadcasting licenses in Canada. Michele-Elise is president of, here I go, Kakekalenicks, sort of, good, yeah, an Indigenous consulting company that promotes Indigenous artists, culture, and education. She's president of Landscape of Nations 360, the beautiful Six Nations Memorial installation at Queenston Heights. She's Indigenous producer for the Celebration of Nations, excuse me, as well as Art Park. She's creator and artistic director of the Circle, the Indigenous Musicians in the Round, as well as Drums Across Canada. Michele-Elise has been very active on the boards of Brock University and Ridley College. She's a board member of the Fort Erie Friendship Center. She created and chairs the Indigenous Partnership Council for the 2022 Canada Summer Games being held in Niagara. This is only part of a very long list of accomplishments of our special guest. Please welcome Michele-Elise Burnet. Thank you.
Chimigwich, Nyawe, Elizabeth, it's so wonderful to finally be with you. I think we've spoken for years, like you said, 2 years while I've been traveling back and forth in the car. So it's just really, I'm really honored to be with everyone tonight. Thank you. Just one little correction, that I am not the president of the Landscape of Nations Commemorative Memorial. I was just part of the steering group of basically erecting and getting that. Basically, I was fundraising. So I was, yes, and did a lot in the sense of like the opening. But I wish I was the president of that beautiful memorial, but I had a little bit to do with that. There was a larger group, a committee. Okay. So Nyawe and Miigwech, and thank you once again for coming together with me in Circle. And I'm really grateful to the Historical Society of St. Catharines for this invitation. And I do mention every time that I want to greet people in my own language. And I always try. I've been working on my language for the last 6 months, taking courses. And once again, it's one part of the colonization where my mother did not speak her language, and therefore it was never passed down to me. So I am going to do, I'm going to try to say what I can in my language as an introduction, just to keep practicing. A lot of our elders and teachers say that we need to keep practicing our language, because our language is our culture, it is our roots. And without that, we lose our culture, we lose our roots, and especially in the Indigenous language. It's all about, it's not so much about the way that we speak is not, we don't have feminine or masculine in our language. And we look at the natural world as part of our kin. So we look at areas, not so much as we would say like this is Sir John A. Macdonald Street, or this is, so we look at language as part of our landscape. And so it's very important that we all try to learn our language again. So I'm going to try to put some breath back into the language, be part of that new movement within our people. So Ani Bojukwe, Nawe Gopa, Nadijnakas, Makwadodam, Nimkidodam, Niagara Dodonjaba, Metis Algonquin and Dow. My name is Michele-Elise Burnet, Bear Clan, and now Thunderbird Clan. I am from Niagara and Buffalo, and I'm Métis with Algonquin roots. As I mentioned before earlier, I am really truly honored to be with everyone here tonight. I am not a historian, but I will do my very best to give you the information that I have been able to gather over the last few years and share that with you. I am a broadcaster, and I'm very much a producer and very much into the arts. So I wanted to say, like, and like I was saying, I'm very grateful to be with everybody. And I want everyone to just sort of take a moment and thinking about gratitude. And gratitude in our teaching is a very, very important gesture, something that we might have forgotten over the last century or so, but it is really our first responsibility. So I want to take a moment just to go through what gratitude is. And every morning I wake up and I put my feet onto Mother Earth and I feel her energy. And I feel also the nourishment and the care that she gives us. And I know that everything that I need and that we need is provided for us. We have clean drinking water. We have food to eat. We have the company right now of all of the singing birds. I was walking my dog beforehand, and the blue jays had such a different sound. And it almost sounded like it was resonating. There was like an echo in the sky. And I looked up and I was like, what bird is that? And it was a beautiful flock of blue jays. But just listening to their sounds and being grateful for the orchestra that they offer us every day. It's a radio station, if you want to say, but they're also giving us beautiful music that we should really be grateful for. We also are grateful for the four winds that come from the four directions. And you see them as they move the clouds in the sky. And today we have this beautiful sun. It might have been cold, but we have this beautiful sun from Brother Sun who, comes up and just embraces us with his beautiful warm rays of love for all living things. And I am grateful also for all of the trees, the medicine plants. I'm looking outside right now and looking at the beautiful forest behind me. And just knowing that these are all our relatives. And I'm also grateful to being with you tonight. So we look at all these beautiful gifts that come to us every single day, every moment, and sometimes we never see them. So gratitude, very important that we start with that responsibility. Gratitude to all of life-sustaining gifts from Mother Earth provides for us. That's what we need to be grateful for every single day. We as humans need to answer that question. What does Mother Earth need or ask from us, though? What are we giving her in return? Are we giving her gratitude? Are we giving her respect? She is our greatest role model. And sometimes I feel that we're not really doing what she's asking us to do, and especially right now with the crisis that we're having, climate crisis. We have to be a little bit more responsible in gratitude and love. So we have to remind ourselves this on a regular basis, that our very existence lies in the gifts of others in the natural world. Maybe we should be more mindful, more grateful, generous, and respectful. Maybe we should follow these original instructions from the Creator. Our shared history could have been different if we did. You're probably wondering why I'm going through all this. But it's very important as Indigenous people. This is our culture and our traditions that I'm sharing with you tonight, so that you can understand a little bit more of the way that we think and the way that we share. And as I would say, words before all else, I'm going to use the Haudenosaunee Thanksgiving address. And it is an opening address that is given. Many different Indigenous nations offer gratitude to the natural world and to themselves and to one another. This one I decided I would like to just sort of give an overview, because sometimes the Haudenosaunee Thanksgiving address could go for 2 days. It can go for 2 hours. It could, and so I'm going to kind of do the Coles Notes version, but and just really kind of giving you the overview of what a Thanksgiving address would be. And they call it the Ganohio. And this is where you address the natural world, and the natural world is thanked. And in thanking each sustaining life force, one becomes tied to each of the forces of the natural world. It teaches us mutual respect, compassion, love, humility, generosity, and also the responsibility that to understand that what we do to one part of the web of life, we do to ourselves. It also reminds us the enormous responsibility humans have to protect and support the very same creatures, elements, and the energies that sustain human life. These teachings constitute a cultural value system that requires both acknowledgement and reciprocity. These teachings produce a cultural value system that promotes environmental stewardship, conservation, and ecological restoration. And they reinforce the realities that we must live in harmony with the natural world and the natural law that governs all of the universe. Sorry for the slide. I couldn't find one that was a little bit better, but I really love what it says. So the collective objective is to collaborate and to create a paradigm shift in order to prevent barriers for our people. And by understanding our philosophies and our ways of life, my hope is to unite and build a stronger, respectful future. When we're talking about the Landscape of Nations Commemorative Memorial, this is where we brought 400 students to the memorial prior to COVID. And we had different stations throughout the Landscape of Nations to educate them. So every 20 minutes, they would go on to another interactive land-based experiential workshop and learning. This was the end of the day, and we did a round dance, a friendship dance. And it was just, to me, this says so much of like all these youth holding hands in harmony and peace. So at this point, I'd like to share a snapshot of history timeline. I'm going to try to go for 13,000 years to present. So bear with me, but I will, because I think it's really important that we understand who we were before colonization, what we have gone through, what we're still going through, so that you have a better understanding of the Indigenous peoples today, basically peeling back 13,000 years of Indigenous history, and specifically here in Niagara. So until recently, the inclusion of Indigenous history and content was virtually absent from the school textbooks. There was very little evidence in the classroom material of important historical and contemporary events that included Indigenous peoples' involvement, knowledge, and perspective, and little to no integration of those events into the larger narrative of the Canadian or even American history. This lack of access to accurate, comprehensive content and appropriate complementary education about the Indigenous experience led to misunderstanding and even defamation of the Indigenous peoples that have persisted for generations. Transforming how and what North Americans are taught about Indigenous people is a strategic priority, because Indigenous students have been taught with materials that left them with very little to no understanding of the world-changing achievements of their own ancestors. Very little was found in that classroom material that would even make an Indigenous child proud of his or her heritage. I was one of those children that went to school, to a French Catholic school in Niagara, and I had to go every day. I would hear about this history. When I'd go home, my mom would say, I was taught what our history is. I'd go back the next day and I'd say, well, our people didn't do that. Or we didn't do that. Or, I think that because my mom wanted me to be proud. Do you know how many times I went into the principal's office and received the strap? I received the strap on a regular basis because I was trying to share our history and trying to be a proud Indigenous girl, whereas my mother was not able to even tell people that of her heritage. She had to keep that secret. So without proper context and understanding of our Indigenous history and culture, most Canadians, even Americans, are unable to fairly evaluate modern issues involving Indigenous governance, rights, and authorities, and therefore make an uninformed civic and policy decisions that negatively impact First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples. In our culture, we teach that every decision that we make today, be it personal, corporate, governmental, whatever it may be, that we must consider the impact it will have on all living things for the next 7 generations. This is not a 3-year, not to look at a 3-year or a 10-year. This is 7 generations. See, this is where my slides. During this talk, I do urge you to think about how we will implement decisions going forward. What can you change today to create a safe, welcoming, safe place for our people to think of every element on every level that will impact your children's great-grandchildren? In the Historical Society, what kind of exhibits can you prepare or to showcase that are in a balance with the European way and also the Indigenous? Do you have a great presence of Indigenous exhibits that sort of balance out the history? When the US government formed the Constitution based on Indigenous democratic system, they formed the Bill of Rights. If we were to base this on true Indigenous ways, it would have been called the Bill of Responsibility. The responsibility to live in a good life, to respect one another and all living things. We should not be saying we have the rights to the land, but rather it should be the rights of the land, as the land has a spirit, as all living things, and it is a living kin of one of ours. When we use these Indigenous ways, we do the right things for the right reasons and not for self-serving purposes and greed. So to put that in perspective, today's Indigenous people are the product of the environment that was imposed upon us over 7 generations ago. I always say that Europeans, if the Europeans or the Western world would have had the foresight or had adopted that 7-generation philosophy, how would things differ today? What would be different? How would we be working together in peace and harmony? So Niagara was a place of awe and wonder, not just for ourselves, but for the Indigenous peoples who walked on these lands before us. Ancestors' footsteps arrived approximately 13,000 years ago as melting glaciers retreated northwards, revealing the Great Lakes of Erie and Ontario and the mighty Niagara River, while giving genesis to the environment rich with life. Indigenous people from Paleo-Indian period to modern times have been an essential part of Niagara region. So if you think about that, it represents 350 generations versus settlers who have been here for 8 to 9 generations. Indigenous nations had established an intricate network of trails and trades, which many road systems follow today. If you think of Carlisle Street and St. Paul Street, that intersection right there was an old portage trail for our people. As we know, the lake actually came up to almost where the Performing Arts Center was. So develop complex systems of governance. This is the history that was never told when I was going to school, and it's just starting to come out. I mean, I would have been proud to know that we had this incredible complex system of governments. And that we had rules and we had democracy. They had, like I said, a complex system of governance that embodied important principles of effective rules such as democracy. Indigenous nations interacted with each other upon their sovereignty. Indigenous nations had full agency and authority in making decisions and recognized each other's sovereignty, practiced diplomacy, built strategic alliances, waged wars, and negotiated legal issues and peace accords. Our ancestors learned to adapt with a changing environment. Indigenous people Technology advancements include like canoes, snowshoes, sunglasses. I even say very much engineers and scientists and mathematicians in a lot of ways. So if you think about the intricacies of building the Great Inca Trail, or an igloo, a longhouse, a teepee, different canoes to navigate different waters, all of that takes science, math, and knowledge. And we know that several scientific and medical contributions have had enormous global impact. This is a projectile that is at the Niagara Historical Museum, Niagara Falls Historical Museum. And this is where so you can see here, is manufactured from the Onondaga Formation chert, which we have quite a bit of chert along Lake Erie, and it goes all the way into Albany. And I believe that it starts from Lake Huron, I believe, but I know it's Great Lakes, and it just follows all the way into Albany, New York. So I'm just going to go and change to. This is also from Landscape of Nations 360, did a documentary, Tim Johnson, and we had some great, wonderful historians, as well as archaeologists and elders, who talked about different aspects of the Indigenous life dating 13,000 years to present. There was an actual form that we found, and it had blood from a mammoth. And that's also at the Niagara Falls Historical Museum. So it's interesting and I think that dated back around 8,000 years ago. So they have an incredible artifacts from that date back. So if anybody has a chance to go and stop by and say hi to Clark Burnet and Suzanne there, you will see a lot of these artifacts out, as well as online. You can go to landscapeofnations.ca, and you can go down and look at this beautiful online exhibit that was produced by Landscape of Nations. So these timely reflections emphasize the value of the land's original societal inventors. Indigenous communities, excuse me, I have a bit of a cold today, so I'm trying to catch my breath. Indigenous communities that continue to occupy Turtle Island have drawn from millennia on deep pools of knowledge characterized by a profound relationship with the land, community, and spirit. And many of the leadership tenets that we consider most progressive today are rooted in the ancestral knowledge. And that's what you'll see in this documentary as well, how we actually were able to show some of the scientific knowledge from the lands and the way that we worked with the lands. In fact, the collaborative leadership models, co-creation, appreciative inquiry, and mindfulness as a tool for societal innovation and transformation are inherited in Indigenous ways of knowing. So I know someone was wondering about the 2-row, thinking outside of the box and inside the 2-row and changing. This is kind of a philosophy that I've come up with over the last few years. And people ask, well, what is that? It's about leaping out of our comfort zone. It's about letting go of the status quo. It's about unraveling all that we think we know and to be common practice, and look at ways of incorporating Indigenous ways of knowing to understanding. So to understand this recipe of building the 2-row for sustainability and growth, one must understand our past. So I'm going to go back to 1613, when the Europeans and the Haudenosaunee agreed to live in a 2-row coexistence, peaceful life together, and later signed what we call the 2-row Wampum Treaty, which was the basis of future treaties. So I'm sure you've probably seen this belt, one of the first ones, like I said, between the two. So you can see the 2 separate beads here of purple beads. Those represent, let's say, I'm looking on my left, we have the settler's vessel, and then on the right, we have the canoe. And neither of them are trying to steer one another along this journey of life on this river. No one is a father and a brother. No one has a hierarchy than the other. We're following this path together. And no one is trying to steer the other's vessel. Between them, you'll see the 3 rows of white beads. And those white beads represent the river of life. These were made to stand for friendship, good minds or respect, and peace, unity. As much as 2 rows keep the nations separate, they also bind them together. One of the philosophies that I've heard about this is that when someone from the canoe would go into the vessel, we would respect their ways. And when someone from the vessel would go into the canoe, they were to respect our ways. So it was a real nice balance and peace and harmony. The 1764 Treaty of Niagara took place predominantly at Fort Niagara and intended to reinforce the terms of the Royal Proclamation of 1763, by which Britain recognized the nationhood and the land rights of Native Americans. The treaty affirmed and extended the covenant chain of friendship to over 24 Indigenous nations. And that was approximately 3,000 leaders from all of Turtle Island. And during that period, this is when Indigenous nations still were acting with full agency, managing their own affairs in context of nation to nations status with Britain. The Crown promised, and this is something that I want you to think about now, or to remember later on, because it's going to come back. And it's very powerful. I find this very powerful, and I want to share that with you. So the Crown promised we would never allow the Indigenous people, their people, to be poor or have their lands taken from them, as long as the grass is green and as long as the waters flow downward and as long as the sun rises in the east and sets in the west. This is a living treaty. It still is alive today. And the grass is still green, and the waters are still flowing downwards, and the sun still rises in the east and sets in the west. But unfortunately, our lands have been taken, and our people live in poverty. We're pretty much non-existent. We're coming back right now. But so this treaty, unfortunately, has not been upheld by this country, and the promise of, and continues to have a negative impact on Indigenous rights. So the contributions of and sacrifices of Indigenous warriors played in the War of 1812 was paramount to Canada, and without their involvement, the British would not have retained what is now Canada. Here you see both Captains John Brandt and John Norton. This is the entrance of the Landscape of Nations Commemorative Memorial, and you can see there's a 2-row path there, showing once again our friendship and hopefully unity. And then here the wrought irons here you see represents the longhouse, and in the middle you'll see a memory circle that represents the 6 nations, the allies that also fought during the War of 1812, and also there's one of the slabs that recognizes the Peace and Reconciliation Treaty of 1815. So with General Brock succumbing to his death very early in the battle, Indigenous warriors John Brandt and John Norton led Indigenous forces at the Battle of Queenston Heights, and with less than 200 Indigenous warriors, they strategically and successfully repulsed the Americans, thereby securing an early victory in the war, which ultimately defined the borders between what is now Canada and the US. Just another piece of history that I would have loved to have known when I was growing up, because I didn't hear that. So here you see this is another view, and you can see the beautiful 2-row Wampum trail. This is the memory circle. And if you have not gone to the Landscape of Nations, please take some time. It's so beautiful in the spring and summer. So after the war, the Indigenous nations who allied and fought side by side with the British friends faced neglect and, even worse, policies designed to strip them from their lands, resources, and culture. They advanced the notion that Indigenous people should be assimilated into the dominant society. So here we were once friends, forging history together. And now they don't need us. And when we had launched and unveiled the Landscape of Nations, one of the things I said, it was kind of like all of a sudden they put a lid on us where we couldn't see the sun, we couldn't breathe. We were like captive into these reserves. And all of a sudden we've lost all of our dignity, our pride. Our people were just basically pushed aside, left, not to be part of the fabrics of this country. So a quote from Duncan Scott, there was really a premeditated plan for us. Like I said, that jar, that lid on it, which did not include us. This was not an accident either. As you can see from the quote here from Duncan Scott, we need to get rid of the Indian problem. He went on to say, our objective is to continue until there is not a single Indian that has not been absorbed into the body politic, and there is no Indian question and no Indian department. This is the Carlisle School, and founder of the Carlisle School was General Pratt. And he said, and this is on the US side, so on both sides, because before this, well, this is just after we had the division of the United States and Canada, but before that, there were no borders. We don't recognize borders with the Jay Treaty. But he said that the only good Indian is a dead one, and that high sanctions of his destruction has been an enormous factor in promoting Indian massacres. That all the Indians there is in the race should be dead. Kill the Indian in him and save the man. This is the kind of propaganda that was going out about who we are. So you think about how people looked at us from that point forward. That is what people thought of us, because you only know what you are told or what you are taught. And if you're only taught to think of the Indians as getting rid of the Indians, then you want to get rid of the Indians, and that becomes a cultural sort of way. These are some young Indigenous men at school studying. And here, I'm not sure how many of you know this, but we were electrocuted if they spoke their language at school. Children, 3, 4, 5, if they were ever caught speaking their language or doing something other than what the regime wanted them to do, some of these schools would actually put them on the chair. They would do so many horrific things to them. So over 210,000 children in both the United States and Canada, 150 of them from Canada, were taken away from their families and forced to go to residential schools, where thousands died from diseases, neglect, malnourishment, mental, physically, and sexually abused. You know, the last school in the US closed in 1978, and the last school that closed in Canada was in 1996. My son was 3 years old at that time. It's hard to believe that it is in my own son, who's 28. It's in his lifetime that one of these schools closed. By the 1930s, the government started to realize that residential schools were no longer meeting their assimilation objectives, and the Indian problem was not going away. So in 1940, the residential schools became orphanages and then eventually child welfare institutions. In the 1960s, a new policies was enacted known as the 60 Scoop. Indigenous children were taken away from their homes and places with non-Indigenous families because the government at that point deemed our people unfit to be parents, and they wanted to whitewash the Indian problem. And currently, we are still dealing with a foster care crisis, and it's far from being history. I show this picture here at AIM Center. I remember reading something, I wish I would have found it to show it to you, and I couldn't find it, but they were advertising children, adoption, Indigenous children to be adopted. And on one of them, it was like buy, like literally like going to a grocery store is buy an Indigenous girl and receive an Indigenous boy at no charge. And I'm just paraphrasing, but my heart just sunk. I could not believe. It just felt like so, inhumane to do that. Oh, that's not what I wanted. See, I told you this is going to happen. Huh. I'm not sure what's happening. Oh, okay. So just in January 25th, the Toronto Star reported yet another 93 unmarked graves that have been found. And also here, there's another one. It's like another 54 potential unmarked graves was the story in the Star the other day. So today, Canadians are facing the harsh realities which we have been living with in our own hearts, in souls and knowledge for decades. As we have over 7,000 unmarked graves, children graves now, that have been uncovered from residential schools. The US actually has twice as many schools and maintains its own system of 367 Indian boarding schools from 1860s to 1978, where the children were also subjected to torture, trauma, and death, and they were kill the Indian and the child. But they also predict that they will find twice as many unmarked graves than in Canada. So combined with the American residential schools or Indian schools and the Canadian residential schools, there's over 500 of these schools in North America. We're already at 7,000 graves. We have only touched the tip of the iceberg of this. There's not just the residential schools, there's the day schools, and there's also the camps, Indian camps. So you just think about this, the horrific truth that is going to be exposed over the next few years. It's something that we all need to stand together because it is our shared future together. But we need to be strong together to get through all of this because it is going to be very damaging. It's going to be hurtful, but I feel that we can build together with this knowledge that we have, this history, this shared history we have, as long as we walk together. So I always ask, so what can we learn from our past about our cross-cultural relationship that will inform the present and define our future? So as we go through history, here's some pictures of how we're living today. Something most North Americans take for granted is a clean glass of drinking water. Just imagine if you were not able to get clean drinking water to your child, your infant, your grandparents, your mother. That says something. It says something. It's a very powerful message that we have our own third world country right here in Canada. It's 2022, and this issue has not gone away. Six Nations, which is very close to us, near Brantford, 10% of their water is clean drinking water, 10%. And it's the largest Indigenous reserve in Canada, and probably the wealthiest as well. I find it completely deplorable. It's also embarrassing as a Canadian that this, here we are in Canada, one of the wealthiest and most water-rich countries, and our people go without clean drinking water, boil advisory. And we go back to the Treaty of 1764, where they had promised that we would not live in poverty. This is how most reserves look like. They're in poverty. These are the people, their ancestors helped define the borders and basically create Canada. This is how we treat them. We need to basically forge a new history going forward. So many of them live in overcrowded housing conditions filled with mold and do not receive the basic UN recognized human rights of clean drinking water or sanitation, lack of medical care and education. The UN reports a lack of housing as a factor that exacerbates the ongoing problem of the missing and murdered Indigenous women, segregation, ostracized, and marginalized from the rest of the country. One can see clearly that our people are the product of the environment that was imposed upon them. Drugs, alcohol, abuse, the murder of missing Indigenous women, all this can be related to centuries of abuse by trying to get rid of the Indian problem from the government. And the disrespect towards all living things, greed, power, and ownership. You think about that. That's why I feel that right now the world is in a crisis. The natural world is in a crisis. And we need to go back to those original instructions that I sort of talked about at the beginning. Whoops. Oh no. I'll get to look at pictures again. My apologies. So I'm going to go to the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls concluded in its 2019 final report that Canadian state has committed genocide against Indigenous people. This genocide is the underlying cause of the contemporary murder and disappearance of Indigenous women and girls. 4 out of 5 of our women are affected by violence today. Indigenous women face murder rates that are more than 10 times the national average. More than half of the Indigenous women have been physically abused by their partners, and a total of 5,712 cases of missing and murdered Indigenous women, to only find out that 116 of those cases were ever included in the Department of Justice official missing persons list. That doesn't add up to me. So with that, this summer I am creating, I'm launching the Red Dress exhibit. If only these dresses could tell their story. I'm taking my production background and my radio background, and I'm going to be putting a sort of like a three-dimensional layer of history through audio. It's going to be a sonic tour of 13 dresses based on the 13 moons, based on the woman's cycle. And these 13 empty dresses will be hanging from trees, but they will have their families. I'm going to be speaking to them on Monday. And these families, these 13 families, are going to either bead, put on ribbons, appliques, paint, whatever that spirit is calling for. And we're going to bring those dresses back to life so that we can tell that untold story of what happened to them. It will be opening up in Art Park September 2nd, and I will be coming to Celebration of Nations the second week, so the 9th, 10th, and 11th of September. We need to build more awareness of this epidemic of ongoing horrific and systemic racism, crimes basically targeting about Indigenous women. Once again, going back to our history. This is part of that intergenerational trauma, but it's also part of that history. And I'm not sure how to erase it, but this is my way of trying to educate people, is to do it through productions. So each person as well that will be representing a spirit will also be interviewed. So when you you download the sonic tour and you go from one dress to the other, you will hear the stories, and they will be also accompanied with our music, our dances, and some words of wisdom. And you'll hear the voices and what these beautiful spirits, how their life, like what their life was all about, and how lovely they were, how beautiful they were. So this is just a thing that I just wanted to share, something like that with you. So genocide. This actually is from the United Nations. So what qualifies genocide? Canada, unfortunately, and I believe the US as well, but I'd have to double check that, checks off almost every, well, actually does, checks off every single box of genocide. The boarding school system is now recognized as a form of genocide. designed to forcibly remove children from their homes and separate them from their families, culture, clothing, and language. Their hair were cut, as you saw in that picture of the two young men studying, in a humiliating manner. Sadistic missionaries punished them for speaking their native tongue, i.e. either washing out their mouths with soap, lye, or chlorine, or even electrocuting them with electric shocks. They were neglected, denied food, beaten, and raped. Sometimes, well, a lot of times now we're finding out that led to deaths, all for the sake of destroying the Indigenous culture. So the Indian timeline, the Indian Act timeline, is something that I'm not going to go through all of it, but I do urge you to look at this. The Indian Act is still present today, and it was created to control and assimilate Indigenous people and their communities. Throughout history, a number of shocking discriminatory measures have been in place. And according to the Indian Commissioner, Luke Lee, it was indispensably necessary that they be placed in positions where they can be controlled, and finally compelled by stern necessity until such time as their general improvement and good conduct may supersede the necessity of such restrictions. Over the ensuing decades, the orientation of Indigenous peoples changed from adversarial to paternalistic, focused on killing the Indian culture. Here is also something I wanted to bring up, that we could not even wear our regalia, and if we did, we'd be punished. And you're looking at these timelines. It was like from 1884 to 1954, ceremonies were banned. We weren't allowed to do that. And you think about the people that come into our country today, they're still able to practice their traditions, their culture, their religions. None of that, we were not able to do that. We weren't even allowed to vote until the 1960s. The Doctrines of Discovery, from the earliest colonial days, violently clearing the lands of Indigenous people like slavery was critical to the formation of this country. Christianity played an instrumental role in advancing violence against Indigenous communities, known as the Doctrines of Discovery. If you haven't seen this or watched this or read about it, I do also urge you to look at this. It provided a religious justification for colonial conquest and exploitation of non-Christian people, and paved the way for the West African slave trade, the slavery, and Indigenous genocide. These last couple of years have shed some horrific light on this country, past, present, and future. And now this country is experiencing basically a wake-up call. It has given us the opportunity to reflect back on a fraught history that includes the displacement of Indigenous people, forced assimilation, the findings of unmarked graves, and the widespread destruction of language and culture, the ongoing crisis of our murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls, and suicide, poor living conditions. I ask this again: what can we learn from our past and present about a cross-cultural relationship, and what will inform the present and define our future? How can we pave a new history together? I think that we need to go back to our original instructions, and that's why I opened up with our culture and traditions and the way that we view the world. And that's living in peace and harmony amongst each other and all living things. We need to learn to love again, be grateful again, generous and respectful, just like our Mother Earth teaches us. If we really truly loved our beautiful trees, would we cut them down because we want to pave a road? If we truly loved parts of the natural world, would we constantly be digging into her and destroying? Those are the questions, that I ask myself. Although, the tides are beginning to change, it was only 7 years ago that the TRC was established and listed the 94 calls to action. How are we doing with those calls to action? How are you changing where you work in your environment in the historical society? How are you basically putting the 94 calls to action into action? Then we had the report just recently of 2019 of the missing and murdered Indigenous women. And finally, the apology from the Pope Francis regarding the Catholic Church's role in the spiritual, cultural, emotional, physical, and sexual abuse of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit children earlier this month. It's 2021. There's still so much to do, and actions are paramount in order to create transformable change. Canada is at a make or break point moment right now, and it has its chance to recast a historical troubled relationship with Indigenous people. But reconciliation must support Indigenous people as they heal from the destructive legacy of colonization that has wreaked such havoc on their lives. But it also must do even more than that. Reconciliation must inspire Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples to transform society so that our children and great-grandchildren can live together in dignity and peace. So I'm asking you to take an active supportive role, an active role in building a strong cross-cultural Canada, which our 7th generation will thank us for. We need true, honest, respectful partners that we can be friends with, and together we need to be great ancestors. We can't be just good ancestors. We need to be great ancestors. Our people are presently in a resurgence pendulum with Indigenous knowledge that has rarely been utilized, unused potential waiting to be unlocked and partnered with. So now is the time to create this cross-cultural paradigm shift required to establish a stronger, united country and set a new platform which other countries will want to emulate. We can't leave this solely in the hands of the government, because after all, we know from history now that it is really not in their best interest to help us out. It is our responsibility as Canadians and as the original people, we need to move it forward and ask the government to take action. With this, I say Chimigwich, Nyawe, Ona, merci. Thanks for sharing your time, and I'd love to answer any questions that you might have. I can stop sharing.
Hi, Michelle. It's
Hello.
Margie Van Kooten.
Oh my goodness, so good to hear your voice.
I saw my friend knew that I'd be interested in this, so she sent it to me, and I managed to get on. How are you, darling? You're looking more and more like your beautiful mother.
Oh, thank you. Thanks for being with us tonight.
Enjoyed your presentation very much.
You've been following me for the last year.
I have my dear. Wherever you go, I am there.
Oh, I love you. Sending you a big hug.
You too, dear.
Michele-Elise, can you hear me?
Yes.
You went to Ryerson, correct? How do you feel about the name change?
I think it's about time.
Yeah.
You know, even when I was going to Ryerson, I didn't even really know. It's once again, it was just something you didn't really know about, and that was back in the late 80s. So I'm happy. I'm happy to see that we're together. Once again, it's together. We're sort of changing. We're not changing, but we're creating a new history together, one based on truths, and it's, I think, a responsibility. I do feel like they all played a role in it, but it's also important to have leaders that are respectful leaders that have done the things for the right reasons, because we have our children that we're raising right now. We want them to see strong leaders, not those that, yeah, so I think that's important.
Good, thanks.
Michelle, I'd like to just make a comment if I could.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's really a shame that rather than taking the Indigenous children away from their parents, which is a disgusting idea, how that came about is very hard to understand how they justified that and thought that was a better way to bring children up away from their parents. If we had learned, rather than trying to take the kids away and teach them in a residential school, if the country in general had learned something from the Indigenous culture, we wouldn't be in the climate change crisis we are in now, because I've thought for some time a lot of values that came from Indigenous people would have dissuaded us from getting into the climate crisis that we're experiencing now.
Thank you so much for your comment. And you probably realize I was touching on that all the way through the presentation, because once again, understanding how we work and live in peace and harmony with our natural world, we would never destroy our natural world. We wouldn't be in taking some of those philosophies and ways from even our treaties of working in balance, we wouldn't be in the position that we are in today. You know, so it's the climate change is something that it would have been, you know, it's in hindsight once again, if they would have adopted some of our ways. I think also adopting ways, Robin Kimmerer, she's a PhD, she's a botanist at the University of Syracuse, but an incredible Potawatomi woman. And I just love her work. We're able to look at our ancestors, the way that they understood science, but they studied and worked with the natural world. And they understood by listening to our older and wiser relatives of the natural world. And she's now able to put it together and looking at the Western ways and the Indigenous ways, the ancient Indigenous ways, just to think about the planting of the bean, the squash, and the corn, and how the symbiotic relationship between all of them, that's millennia that our people have been doing that. And now science is proving that it's actually scientifically proven now. So there's a lot of Indigenous ways, ancient ways that are being proven today. So if they would have listened, if they would have maybe brought us in and worked with us, I think that we'd be further ahead as a society or as people than we are today.
Gail has her hand up.
Yeah, yes, I do. I guess I should put my video on. Yes, a very wonderful talk. Thank you very much, Michelle. I wonder if you're aware, I'm certainly not aware of any of the history textbooks being changed to include the timeline, at least of the Indian Act. I mean, I'm in my 70s and I learned nothing about this. None of us, I think, did. There was just absolutely no information given to us. Are you aware of any attempts to have new information provided in texts to the younger generation?
I do. Landscape of Nations 360, and I see that Sarah King Head is on our line here. She's actually part of our roundtable group. We are in the midst of doing exactly that. And in September of this coming year, we will be launching our first module in the schools. We've been working on this for the last 4 years, 5 years actually. And this right here is the framework for the essential understandings about Indigenous people of the Niagara region. And here what we did is with our elders or academics, knowledge keepers, historians, geographers, archaeologists, we have been working to reverse engineer all of our knowledge and align it with the Ministry of Education's educational mandates. And so this kind of gives you an idea of the difference. So individual development and identity. So the key concepts, and it aligns it like for grade, you can see grade 3, grade 4, so geography, and hits all these different areas. We're very excited to be kind of one of the first to be doing that, and we're launching that here in Niagara. And hopefully that will spread out through our country.
Thank you. That's excellent. Thanks.
It's important. This generation, the youth, really are the ones, that's our future. And they are the ones that are going to carry that torch, and they're the ones that are going to change. And we need to support them and give them as much information, tools, and skills to understand how to change and transform our country.
Were there any other questions? I don't see any. I'm just going to search to see if there's any virtual hands up here. Oh, we got Brenda.
Hi, I just wondered, would it not give them a leg up if they got off the reserve and away from this boiled water situation? If they did come into native homes in the community?
I'm sorry, so I'm saying you're asking if it would be better for them, for the Indigenous people to leave the reserve and go somewhere else?
Yeah, because all the ones that I know are doing quite fine in native homes throughout the city. They seem to.
Yeah, okay, so that's a very difficult, that to me is I'm gonna see.
Can I just add why I think that? I just don't know how this water situation is horrible in modern times. And I'm just wondering how we can have the lovely homes and infrastructure there. How can we get that into the reserve?
Well, there shouldn't be any barriers, first of all. But how would you like it if somebody asked you to just uproot and go to city life, because and leave your community, leave your family?
Right.
I find that a very difficult question to answer. I think that it's just not something that they're able to do either. They may not financially be able to leave, and that is all they can, is to stay on reserve, and because that's what they can afford.
Mhm.
That's a very difficult question. I can't answer that and can't speak for everybody, but as an urban Indigenous person, I was very fortunate, but not everybody is.
Like, is there the tax base there to put these water pipes and water systems in there for them?
Is there?
Yeah, 'cause
The government, I think, really, there's been a discord with the provincial government and the federal government of whose responsibility it is of the Indigenous people, in different areas fall into different categories, fall into different hands. So the whole water crisis is actually very deep-rooted politics that we could be here for hours to go into it. I've been talking to people in the States right now about Tuscarora and their water crisis. It's deplorable. I really feel that if we can bring in people and refugees from all over the world that are leaving their country for a safer haven and coming to our country, where we are able to give them security and housing and clean drinking water, which they may not have had back home, why can't we have that here with our own people? That is a government question. That's all politics.
Mhm. Okay.
Yeah, that's going to be a difficult one to resolve over time. When we were in one of our circles, Julia Kane Murray, she had us do an exercise, which was very, very difficult. I had a very difficult time. I see that Lorraine is on as well. And she asked us to go up as groups and to identify different areas in reserves that had clean drinking water, boil advisory, or contaminated water. And she also said, you need your phones, because if you take an Ontario map, unfortunately, not all the reserves are even on this map. And for me, that's when I just broke down crying, because if we're not even on the map, that means that we don't exist. And if we don't exist, then people don't, it's just like nothing's going to happen. Nothing's going to change there. You don't see anything, you don't hear anything, you don't exist. So, I mean, these are deep political issues that are really difficult to answer.
Yeah, and it's off the reserve as well, because there was the big pipe issue all along lakeshore of Lake Erie. And again, it was a money thing. People didn't want to pay for the extra tax to bring in fresh water, so they stayed on their boiled water.
Yeah. I'm just going to read something that Lorraine just shared, because Lorraine is part of our, I didn't realize that you're on as well, but as part of our Landscape of Nations roundtable group and educators, who has been extremely just a wealth of knowledge in putting all this together, because I said, I'm not a historian, I'm not an educator either. So, and she's really helped tremendously in putting out the Landscape of Nations Indigenous Education Initiative. But she says here, first unit of the Landscape of Nations that I was speaking about on the War of 1812. It's written for grade 7 students and meets the Ontario Ministry of Education history curriculum. The curriculum was updated in 2018 to include the contributions of Indigenous peoples. So thank you, Lorraine.
Thanks, Michele-Elise, and I enjoyed your talk tonight. It's lovely to see you again.
Oh, I can't see you. I miss you.
I miss you too.
There you are.
Virtual hug. But thank you very much for your presentation.
Oh,
Everyone, I think it was beneficial for everyone who was listening with open ears and ready to hear all the things that you had to say. So much appreciated.
13,000 years is not easy.
No, hope to see you again.
See, I learned something, Lorraine, during the last few years.
Good night, Michelle.
Good night, Mrs. Van Kooten.
You too, love. Love you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Hey, I'm just looking at it. Were there any other questions? Okay. So I think that's it. I think Amy, you mentioned the one comment there, I think was important of the Landscape of Nations. I've just taken a quick look on my iPad here on the website. So I know I'm going to be looking at that website, and I encourage everyone to take a look at that, because as you said, as you mentioned with schools, and like when you were in school, things like that weren't there. Well, you know, it's good to see this and see how, you know, things have changed and will be changing. So I'll take a look at that.
Mhm.
Actually, we just got, yeah, lon360.ca, exactly. So no, it's very easy to find, and I do encourage everyone to look at it. I'll be looking at it after this. So Michelle, just want to thank you for this presentation. As you said in the beginning, I think it's important we get, we at the Historical Society, we hear as many different perspectives as possible. That's something, you know, we made a commitment to do. We will continue to make a commitment to do. So I want to thank you for your presentation, and thank you for, you know, putting the time to come here and speak to us. It is very appreciated.
Thank you very much. It's been an honor to be with everybody. I'm very grateful for Elizabeth for being so, you know, for the last 2 years, and I'm really glad that we can share some time together.
It's great. We finally made it. We connected.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank
Thank
you,
you.
Michelle.
Yeah. Take care and
It's
have
been
a
great.
wonderful
And
day.
thanks to all that joined, all the new people too.
Yes, a lot of new people tonight. It was
Yeah.
terrific.
Wonderful.
Good night, everyone.
Okay,
And thank you.
thank you, everyone. Okay, bye
Good
now.
night. Good night, Michelle.
Good night.
Good light just came on.
Bye.
Wow. Okay, how do you?